You type an address into your phone, a little blue dot lights up, and a calm voice tells you exactly where to turn. And somehow, even with all of that, you've still pulled into the wrong parking lot in a city you've visited 4 separate times. Be honest, it's happened. Now take all of it away. No phone, no dot, no voice, no paper map, no line on the ground that says road, no sign, no one alive who has ever been where you're about to go. Because nobody has. The place doesn't have a name yet. You'd be the person who names it. That was the situation every single human on Earth was in for almost the entire time there have been humans. And here's the part that should stop you for a second. They got everywhere anyway. Every habitable stretch of land on this planet, every continent except Antarctica, islands you'd need a plane to reach today, valleys walled off by mountains, coastlines 1,000 miles from anywhere, had people standing on it long before anyone drew a single map or invented a single wheel. So how? How does a slow, thin-skinned, clawless animal with no built-in compass and no roads and no idea what's over the next ridge end up covering an entire planet on foot? Because that's the thing we quietly forget about ourselves. We tend to picture our ancestors as basically stuck, planted next to a river, wandering a few miles out for berries, dying more or less where they were born. Homebodies with spears. They were the opposite. Human beings are, no exaggeration, one of the most restless animals that has ever existed. We are the only creature that will stand on a beach, stare at open water with no land visible in any direction whatsoever, and think, really, sincerely think, yeah, I bet there's something good over there. Every other animal on that beach has the basic sense to stay on the beach. We start looking around for logs. And buried in that restlessness is a real question, one that nobody actually answers when they hand you the tidy version of prehistory. We know people ended up everywhere. What gets skipped is the how, the actual machinery of moving a human body, plus everything it needs to stay alive, from one side of the world to the other, using none of the equipment we file under the word travel. No wheel, no horse for most of the story, no written directions left for whoever came after. Just bodies, whatever they could carry, and a direction. You already have an answer for this, by the way. Most of us were handed the same one, and it goes like this. It was slow. Ancient people spread out gradually, over thousands of years, drifting a little farther each generation, trailing after animals or better weather, not really going anywhere on purpose so much as slowly leaking across the map. And whenever they hit a real barrier, a sea or a strait, they waited for an ice age to lower the water and then walked across the land bridge that appeared. Bering, Sundar. Dry corridors that opened up when the oceans pulled back. And honestly, that's a good answer. It's the one most textbooks give, most documentaries repeat, and for enormous stretches of the human story, it happens to be exactly right. Sea levels really did drop hundreds of feet during the ice ages. Land bridges really did surface. People really did walk out of Asia and into the Americas across what is now the floor of the Bering Sea. If the whole story were, they waited for the water to leave, then walked, it would be clean and sensible and easy to draw. There's just one problem with it, and it's a large one. The land bridge story has a hole in it you could sail a boat through. Because there is a place people reached, early, tens of thousands of years ago, that never had a land bridge. Not at the lowest sea level of the deepest ice age. Not at any point. Between the islands of Southeast Asia and the ancient landmass that became Australia sits a band of deep ocean that has stayed deep the entire time our species has existed. The water never left, and people crossed it anyway. It's not only Australia either. Once you start looking, the map turns out to be freckled with places that sit on the wrong side of water that never dried up. Islands people were already living on, while the mainland nearby was still treating the sea as a wall. The walking story doesn't just have one hole. It springs leaks everywhere the moment you follow the arrows out to the coast. That's the part the neat little migration maps tend to leave off. Those confident arrows that march across dry land and then go strangely quiet the moment they reach blue. Because what happened at that water's edge is a stranger and far more impressive thing than they walked. And it's where the real answer to how ancient humans traveled actually begins. Let me show you what "crossed it anyway" actually means. Stand on the last island. Timor, let's say, right on the lip of that deep water gap, somewhere around 50,000 years ago. You're looking south, and there is nothing out there. No smudge of land on the horizon, no hint of a far shore, because on that southern route, the far shore sits below the curve of the Earth, too distant to see at all. Just open water, running clean to the edge of the sky. The crossing to Australia was, at the absolute minimum, something like 100 kilometers of open ocean. Call it 60-odd miles of nothing, 2 to 3 times longer than any of the little island hops that had carried people that far in the first place. And the researchers who've modeled this thing, running ocean drift simulations, then working backward from what the genetics say about how many people had to land to start a population that actually lasted, keep arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. This was not an accident. You do not seed an entire continent with the occasional fisherman blown off course. It took dozens of people, quite possibly many more, deliberately building watercraft and aiming them at open water they had every reason to believe led absolutely nowhere. Sit with the human size of that for a moment. Somebody had to be the first to push off. Somebody had to talk enough other people into it. Families, children, whoever you need to start a population that doesn't just flicker out on the far shore. To climb onto a raft of wood and fiber and paddle away from the only land any of them had ever seen, toward a horizon offering back exactly nothing. There was no scouting party paddling home with a report. You went, or you didn't. At least 50,000 years ago, and by some of the evidence closer to 65,000, human beings stood in front of an ocean with no visible other side, and crossed it on purpose. And now, the genuinely strange part. We have never found the boat. Not one. The oldest boat anyone has ever pulled out of the ground anywhere on Earth. A dugout canoe carved from a single pine log dug out of a Dutch peat bog, is only around 10,000 years old. Which means the single oldest piece of evidence for seafaring on this entire planet is not a boat at all. It's a continent. It's a whole landmass full of people who simply could not have walked there. Their boats rotted away roughly 40,000 years before the oldest surviving one was even carved. The crossing itself is the proof. How is a human being even capable of that? On the water, yes, but also, and this is the much larger story, on land. Start with the machine itself. Long before any boat, evolution had already built the human body into a long-distance travel device, and it left the blueprints sitting right there in the skeleton. In 2004, Dennis Bramble and Daniel Lieberman published a paper in Nature making the case that we've basically been reading our own bodies wrong this whole time. We line ourselves up next to a cheetah or a horse and feel hopelessly slow, and over a short sprint, we are. Almost any four-legged animal will leave us standing. But stretch the distance out, past a sprint into miles, past miles into hours, and the whole picture flips. Look at what's actually in there. The Achilles tendon acts like a spring, stretching and snapping back to hand. Energy free to the next stride instead of wasting it. There's a second spring in the arch of the foot doing the same trick lower down. The gluteus maximus, that enormous muscle you're sitting on, fires with every step, mainly to keep your torso from pitching forward, which matters far more when you run than when you stroll. A small band in the neck called the nuchal ligament exists to hold your head steady, while everything below it is pounding, and the balance organs in the inner ear are enlarged in our lineage for what seems to be the same reason: to stop the world from bouncing while you move. And then there's the sweat. Humans carry millions of sweat glands across mostly bare skin, which means we shed heat while still moving, at the exact moment a furred animal has to stop and pant in the shade. Put all of that together, and you get a creature that overheats slower and keeps going longer over open ground than nearly anything it might be chasing or fleeing. That body is around 2 million years old. The travel technology wasn't invented. It was inherited. If that sounds like a nice theory, there's a town in Wales that tests it every June. In Llanrwtyd, Wales, they run a race called Man vs. Horse, 22 miles of hills, human runners against riders on horseback. The kind of matchup that ought to be a flat-out joke. The horse wins most years, but not every year. On a hot, dry day, when the heat starts quietly punishing an animal that can't sweat the way we do, the gap narrows, and a handful of times now, a runner has crossed the finish line ahead of every horse on the course. Over a sprint, it would be humiliating for us. Over distance, in the heat, the naked ape has a real shot. That is not some quirk of the modern marathon crowd. It's 2-million-year-old hardware doing precisely what it was shaped to do. And if you want to see what that body can do out in the world, rather than on a race course, you don't even have to imagine it. Louis Liebenberg spent years out in the Kalahari documenting it directly. There, San hunters run an antelope, an animal that can outsprint any human without breaking a sweat, to death. Not by catching it, by refusing to quit. The animal bolts, gets well ahead, stops in the shade to cool off. The hunters keep coming at a steady jog. It bolts again, and this repeats for hours under the midday sun until the animal, which can't shed heat the way a person can, simply overheats and drops. The human wins by outlasting, never by outrunning. How central this particular tactic was to our evolution is honestly still argued among scientists. But that a person can chase a faster animal into the ground across open country, on nothing but endurance, is not in any doubt. That's the range we're talking about. A body that treats very, very far as a normal afternoon. The last time you hit 10,000 steps without really trying, and your phone lit up to congratulate you, like you'd accomplished something. That's the faint, house-trained echo of an animal that used to run its dinner into the ground. A body that can go far explains reach. It doesn't explain the other thing the evidence keeps turning up, which is that this travel was not some one-way drift into the void. People went and came back and went again, deliberately for specific things. There's a cave on the coast of Greece, Franchthi, where archaeologists found tools napped out of obsidian, that black volcanic glass that flakes into edges sharper than surgical steel. The catch is that the nearest source of that particular obsidian is the island of Melos, more than 100 kilometers away across open sea, and the trail runs back roughly 13,000 years. So people living on the Greek mainland were getting into boats, crossing to one specific island for one specific stone, and hauling it home, over and over, often enough and long enough to leave a clear signature in the dirt. That's not a lost wanderer. That's a supply run. That's a route somebody already knew, being used before farming had taken real hold anywhere, before the first city, before the wheel. And think about everything folded into a trip like that. You need a boat that survives open water. You need to read the sea well enough to know which mornings are worth the risk and which will kill you. You need to hold the way there and the way back in your head with nothing written down. A single black flake of glass in a cave on the Greek coast is quietly carrying all of that information at once, which lands us on the question we've been circling this whole time. Fine. The body goes far. The trips were on purpose. But how did anyone actually find the way? No compass, no map, nothing written down to mark a single landmark for next time. They read everything. The sky, obviously. The sun by day, and by night, an entire memorized wheel of stars turning overhead. But also the ocean itself. The direction of the long swells, and the way they bend and scatter around land you can't yet see. The flight lines of seabirds streaming out at dawn and back at dusk, pointing straight at their roosts on some shore over the horizon. A change in the color of the water. A particular cloud that only ever forms above an island. And then they stored all of it. Not on paper, but in memory and in song. Aboriginal songlines across Australia encode routes that run for enormous distances as sequences of verses, where the order of the song matches the order of the land, so that knowing the song is knowing the way. The Polynesian navigators who settled the open Pacific much later are the clearest surviving window we have into the whole technique. People crossing thousands of miles of empty ocean with no instrument of any kind, carrying a complete star map and the feel of the swells entirely in their heads, holding their own position the whole way as a running mental tally of speed and time, and every course change since the last patch of land they were sure of. Most of us lose the thread somewhere between the parking lot and the mall doors. In the Marshall Islands, they even made the knowledge physical. Little lattices of thin sticks tied together with shells, where the sticks traced the way ocean swells curve and collide around the islands, and the shells mark the islands themselves. Not a picture of coastlines. A map of how the water behaves, studied on land, and then usually left at home. Because once you'd learned it, you carried the thing inside you. The map existed. It just lived inside a person and got passed down out loud. And when the conditions lined up, all of this added up to something that still catches people off guard. They were quick. There's a site called Monte Verde near the southern tip of Chile where humans were living around 14,500 years ago. Picture what that means on a map. Getting there meant coming down from the top of North America and traveling the entire length of 2 continents, most of the way from one pole toward the other, and doing it, on the current evidence, startlingly fast. Not the slow, dribbling, thousands of years ooze the old story pictured. When people had a direction and open country ahead of them, they moved at a pace that keeps forcing archaeologists to drag their own timelines earlier and earlier. And a growing number of them now suspect the fastest way south wasn't overland at all. It was by boat, hopping down the Pacific coast in short jumps, living off the kelp beds and shellfish the whole way. If that's right, then the same seafaring nerve that dropped people onto Australia was also quietly speeding up how fast 2 entire continents got filled. Line up all 5 of those: the body, the range, the round trips, the navigation, the speed. And the thing that comes into focus isn't a species that accidentally spread. It's a species that traveled the way it breathes, without thinking about it, everywhere. Which brings it right back around to you, and the blue dot. Because here's what hasn't budged in 50,000 years. You are walking around with the exact same equipment those people had. The same body, built to go absurdly far. And the same head that can't quite leave the horizon alone. The one that looks at a map, or a cheap flight, or just a road you've never driven down, and feels a small tug with no practical justification behind it at all. You don't need to go. You want to. That tug is the oldest thing about you. When you take the long way home just to see a street you've never been on. When you've got a tab open right now for a trip, you're only half planning, to somewhere you have no real reason to visit except that you've never laid eyes on it. When you stand somewhere high, look out, and feel that specific pull toward the farthest edge of what you can see, you are doing the precise thing that carried a naked, clawless, slow-sprinting animal out of a single valley in Africa and onto every shore on Earth. Same body, same itch. The person standing on that beach in Timor, staring south at an ocean with no other side and deciding to build a raft regardless, that wasn't some other kind of human. That was you, with worse shoes. The whole planet got mapped by people who felt what you feel, and, unlike most of us most days, didn't talk themselves out of it. The maps are all filled in now. Every coastline drawn, every island named, the blue dot forever certain of exactly where you're standing. Which is a genuinely odd thing to be among the first humans ever to live with, while the itch that drew all those maps in the first place is still sitting right there in your chest, completely unaware that the job is finished. So I'm curious, what's the farthest you've ever gone somewhere for no good reason at all? Just to see it. Not the practical trip, the one that was only ever about the pull.